quiet American diocese, 4 priests vanished over 5 years, none officially declared missing. It started with a stormy night and an old church bell that should have stayed silent. As a single mother begins digging, she uncovers a hidden monastery, forbidden rituals, and a chilling message left behind. They are not dead. They are used. What she finds next forces her to choose truth or survival. The night Father Michael disappeared, the rain came down like punishment. The streets of Pinecrest were slick with water, glistening under flickering street lamps as thunder rolled above the modest town. At St. Isidore's Parish, a quiet but devout Catholic church nestled at the edge of town, something shifted. Something that would echo through the community for years. No one noticed anything wrong at first. Father Michael had been the town's priest for over a decade, a quiet man, sharp with his sermons, gentle in his rebukes, and always present for the funerals and baptisms that defined Pinecrest's rhythm. He lived alone in the rectory beside the chapel, an aging stone building with ivy crawling up the walls and paint peeling from the windowsills. By morning, his absence felt like a glitch in the routine. The church doors were locked, the rectory lights off. Parishioners assumed he was out running errands or visiting the nearby seminary, though that wasn't his habit. It wasn't until the midday rosary went unled and then the evening mass was canceled that whispers began to travel. The next day, after the wooden door to his residence was forced open, the sheriff found his living quarters perfectly in order, a pot of coffee half filled on the warmer, slippers placed neatly by the hearth, his worn Bible lying open on the desk, with a bookmark between Psalms 91 and 92. There were no signs of struggle, no missing items, no letters or notes. Just a lingering chill, as if the windows had been open too long, though they were all shut tight. What disturbed Sheriff Harlan most wasn't what was missing, but what remained. Father Michael's white collar still resting on the nightstand beside his bed. He'd never been seen without it. Rumors began to swirl. Some said he'd run off, burned out by the burden of serving a shrinking parish. Others said perhaps he'd had a health emergency and wandered off into the storm. Search dogs were brought in. They tracked his scent as far as the muddy trail behind the rectory, then lost it near the edge of the creek. The rains had likely washed everything away. 3 days passed. Then came the old woman's story, and it changed everything. Her name was Ethel Caraway, a widow who attended Mass every Sunday without fail, sitting in the second pew from the front, clutching a worn rosary with knotted fingers. On the night Father Michael vanished, Ethel claimed she couldn't sleep. The storm had rattled her windows, and so she stayed up knitting by the soft light of a gas lamp. Around 2:13 a.m., she heard it, the bell. It wasn't just a chime, she insisted, to anyone who would listen. It was the full peal, like someone was calling us to worship. The problem was, the church bell had been broken for years. Mechanically cracked and too costly to repair, it was nothing more than a relic now. Parish records confirmed that, and yet several other residents near the church admitted, reluctantly, that they had heard something that night too, a distant, echoing clang, muffled by the rain, but unmistakable. That sound hadn't rung since the summer a teenager tried to steal the clapper and broke the entire mechanism. No one had the key to the bell tower anymore, not even Father Michael, or so people thought. Ethel's memory, usually muddled by age, seemed laser-sharp when recounting that night. It rang 12 times, she said, slow and steady, then nothing. Her words cast a shadow over Pinecrest. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore, it was a mystery. Within the week, the diocese released a carefully worded statement. Father Michael was on a personal retreat. The phrasing raised eyebrows. Priests took sabbaticals, not silent retreats in the middle of the night. But questions were discouraged. A young deacon named Elias was assigned to temporarily oversee the parish. He was soft-spoken and serious, and never quite looked anyone in the eye. The community adapted uneasily. Sunday Mass resumed. Ethel continued to sit in her usual pew, eyes drifting toward the bell tower, and for all their efforts to explain it away, the rain, the stress, the collective trauma, no one ever figured out how an unusual bell rang 12 times the night Father Michael disappeared. What they didn't know, and wouldn't know for years, was that this was only the beginning. 8 months after Father Michael's disappearances, the whispers had begun to settle into silence. Life in Pinecrest trudged on, as it always did, with quiet Sunday mornings and casseroles after Mass. The new priest, Father Thomas Kearney, was different, less reserved than his predecessor, more open in his approach to sermons and pastoral care. He brought an energy that the community found reassuring, even hopeful. His presence softened the unease that had taken root, though it never quite vanished. Yet even in his warmth, there was a hesitance in his eyes when he looked toward the bell tower, a pause in his voice whenever someone mentioned the retreat. He never spoke of Father Michael, not directly. When asked, he offered a careful smile and said, "Let us pray for his peace, wherever he may be." Then one Thursday afternoon in early March, he was simply gone. The church secretary, Mrs. Flanagan, arrived at the rectory with the usual weekly collection reports, only to find the front door slightly ajar. Inside, everything looked untouched. Books still on shelves, vestments neatly hung, teacup with a spoon resting beside a stack of envelopes. But Father Thomas was nowhere to be found. His car remained in the driveway. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, turned off. There was no note, no indication of travel, no planned absence listed on the diocese calendar. The only clue, if it could be called that, was the last entry in his journal, which the sheriff found tucked beneath the hymnal on his desk. It read, "I heard it again last night, the bell, 12 times the same cadence. It's not the wind. I know it now." That line stopped the investigation cold. Sheriff Harlan closed the journal and didn't show it to anyone outside his office. When asked at the next town meeting, he said only that Father Thomas had taken a leave of absence. The diocese followed suit, echoing that phrase in their official statement, nearly identical to the one issued the year prior. But the people of Pinecrest were no longer willing to accept silence as an answer. Unease settled like dust in the chapel rafters. Some parishioners began skipping Mass. Others turned fervent, clinging to routine as if their faith could hold the world together by sheer repetition. But in the background, something else was happening, something the townsfolk didn't notice until much later. It started with small things: flickering lights in the sacristy, communion wine souring too quickly, whispers heard in the confessional when no one was inside. The church groundskeeper, Elias Maddox, a stout, no-nonsense man in his 50s, had worked the property since before Father Michael's tenure. He was the sort who didn't scare easily, not even when the wind howled through the trees like voices calling from afar. But one morning, while trimming the hedges near the rear storage shed, he stumbled on something that made him stop cold. Hidden beneath a weather-beaten tarp beside a rusted wheelbarrow was a leather-bound Bible, old, fragile, and unlike any he'd seen in the church library. It wasn't catalogued, didn't match the editions commonly used in the pews. Curious, Elias took it to his tool bench and flipped through the brittle pages. The text was in English, but certain passages, dozens of them, were defaced. Black ink had been used to strike through specific verses, all having to do with blood sacrifice, atonement, and offerings. Leviticus, Hebrews, even parts of the Gospels were blotted out with perfect precision. But what chilled Elias most wasn't the ink, it was the final page. A loose sheet had been tucked inside the back cover. Almost ceremonially on it, someone had copied a single verse from Hebrews 9:22. "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." And beneath it, in smaller handwriting, was the phrase, "He agreed." They all do eventually. Elias closed the Bible, heart thudding against his ribs. He didn't tell the sheriff, not at first. Instead, he placed the book in an old ammo box, locked it, and buried it beneath the azaleas by the north wall of the church. The next Sunday, he resigned from his post without explanation. When pressed, he simply said, "I'm not meant to tend to that ground anymore." By then, the community was splintering. The absence of 2 priests in less than a year wasn't coincidence, not to those who had known these men. Ethel Caraway, now treated with a kind of cautious reverence, began sitting outside the church with a candle every evening, insisting it wasn't safe to pray indoors anymore. "The altar's been touched," she'd whisper. "Tainted." A few brave souls ventured to ask Bishop Calderone from the Archdiocese to intervene, but the bishop never came in person. Instead, he sent another substitute, a young seminarian named Jonah Rowe, who had only recently completed his studies. Jonah was earnest but green, clearly uncomfortable in his role. His hands shook slightly when distributing the Eucharist. His homilies were short, rarely deviating from official liturgical readings. One morning he asked Elias, before the groundskeeper left, whether there was any way to reach the bell tower. Elias stared at him, jaw clenched, then turned and walked away without saying a word. They brought in Father Calhoun 3 weeks after Jonah Rowe quietly withdrew from his assignment without any public statement. No one questioned it anymore. By then, the pattern had become an undercurrent in Pinecrest, subtle but undeniable. Priests arrived, stayed just long enough to settle the nerves of a jittery congregation, and then they were gone. Father Nathan Calhoun was different, at least at first glance. He walked with the posture of someone who had spent a decade in military boots, shoulders rigid, eyes scanning like he was still on patrol. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a military chaplain before transitioning back into parish life, and the weight of those years hung on him like invisible armor. He kept to himself, speaking little outside the pulpit, and maintained a strict routine. Rise at 4:30, pray before sunrise, maintain the sanctuary before anyone else arrived. But there were signs, even early on, that he carried something dark within him. His hands, though steady when blessing communion, trembled slightly when he passed by the sacristy door. Once, after Sunday service, he stood in the doorway of the chapel for nearly 30 minutes, unmoving, watching the altar without wasting looked almost hollow. At night, the cleaning staff said he'd pace the main aisle alone, whispering fragments of Latin clergy under his breath. Then came the light. It started subtly, a reddish hue flickering against the stained glass windows after midnight, faint and wavering like a candle behind thick curtain. Most dismissed it as tricks of the eye or tail lights from passing cars. But Father Calhoun knew better. In his private journal, which would later be discovered beneath the floorboards of the rectory's confessional room, he recorded entries that grew increasingly frantic. The red light again, just past midnight. It comes from inside the tabernacle. Another day. I opened it, nothing there, but I felt heat, like breath on the back of my neck. He wrote about the flicker that became a pulse, a slow, throbbing glow that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. "It's not electricity," he scrawled. "It's watching, like it remembers me." As the weeks passed, his sermons grew erratic. Once he stopped mid-homily and stared at the crucifix for a full minute, then said, "Some wounds never stop bleeding," before ending the Mass abruptly. Another Sunday, he spoke of the desert, but not the biblical one. "In Helmand, we buried men in silence," he said, "but nothing there ever stayed buried. And here? I see them again." His congregation began thinning. People whispered about him in grocery store aisles and outside the pharmacy. Still, no one dared speak directly to the dioceses. They didn't want another silence. They wanted answers. Then, one night, he vanished. The rectory door was ajar. The lights were off. A faint trace of iron lingered in the air, sharp and metallic, like blood or old coins. His boots were by the door, laces neatly tucked in. On the kitchen table sat his military dog tags beside a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." Inside was a single line, "It followed me home." But what made the third disappearance different, what truly shook Pinecrest, was what happened 2 days later. Marcus Doyle, a longtime funeral assistant who had handled dozens of ceremonies at the town's only mortuary, walked into his manager's office, pale and shaking. "I can't work here anymore," he said flatly, avoiding eye contact. His supervisor, Gerald Briggs, asked what was wrong. Marcus remained silent at first, then pulled out a small laminated card, the kind included in memorial programs. "This was last week's funeral," he said. "James Carraway, 87, passed peacefully in his sleep." Gerald nodded. "And?" "Look at the photo," Marcus whispered. "That's not what I saw." He described it slowly, like each word cost him something. "I opened the casket for viewing. I looked at the face and thought nothing of it at first. Old man, peaceful expression. But then I noticed the hair." He swallowed. "It was black, jet black. James was gray for 20 years. Gerald frowned. "Could have been dyed. Some families do that for the wake." "It wasn't just the hair," Marcus said. "The skin, the texture, the way the jaw sat, it looked like him, but it wasn't. It was like someone wearing him, or something trying to remember how to look like him." The worst part, he said, came when he adjusted the collar of the deceased suit and saw a faint red stain underneath, dry but fresh enough to smell like iron. Marcus stepped back, staring down at the body, and in that moment the eyes fluttered, just once. No one believed him. Gerald called it stress, too much overtime, maybe even burnout from being around death too long. But Marcus wouldn't be convinced. He left his apron, his keys, and his name tag on the desk, and he never returned. Later that week, Ethel Carraway, the widow of the man buried, swore she heard someone whisper her name from the garden late at night. She lived alone. The whisper wasn't angry or mournful. It was confused, like someone who had forgotten who they were. Her name was Camille Renshaw, a single mother of two who worked nights at the diner off Route 5 and sang in the church choir on Sundays. She wasn't the kind of person who sought attention or stirred gossip, but when the padded brown envelope arrived without return address, something in her gut said it wasn't junk. It was a Tuesday, raining lightly, the kind of day where everything moves slower in Pinecrest. She found the package wedged awkwardly in her mailbox, damp around the edges but still sealed. Inside was no note, no explanation, just an old black-and-white photograph folded once down the center. At first glance she thought it was a vintage parish event, children in modest clothing that could have been a church or schoolhouse. But when she unfolded it fully, her breath caught in her throat. There, near the center, with one hand resting on a boy's shoulder, was Father Michael. Younger, perhaps by 15 years, but unmistakably him. Same sharp eyes, same Roman collar, same half-smile that she remembered from Sundays long gone. She turned the photo over. No date, no writing. The only hint of location was a faint outline of pine trees in the background and what looked like a wooden gate. She studied the children's faces. Most were smiling. One wasn't. A little girl with light hair and hollow eyes stared directly into the camera. Camille swore the eyes followed her no matter how she tilted the page. That night, she waited until her kids were asleep before pulling out the shoebox under her bed, where she kept her late grandmother's keepsakes. Among the prayer cards and clippings was a contact, Mrs. Tilda May, a retired archivist who once managed records for the diocese. Camille hadn't spoken to her in years, but she dialed anyway. Tilda answered on the third ring. Her voice hadn't changed. Camille explained about the photograph, about Father Michael and the children. There was a pause, then a rustle of paper. "You need to check the diocesan library," Tilda said. "There used to be a file on St. Alora's Haven. It was a Catholic-run residence outside town, way off the main roads. Closed in the late 80s under unclear circumstances." The next morning, Camille drove to the library annex behind St. Augustine's Seminary. It wasn't open to the public, but she'd once volunteered there sorting hymnals, so the staff remembered her and let her in without question. The archive room smelled like dust and faint mildew. Row after row of metal drawers stretched down the hall, alphabetized and categorized with an obsessive neatness. She found the file under Habitat Missions and Healing Ministries. It was thin, much thinner than she expected. Inside were brittle pages listing the Foundation's charter, a vague note about its purpose, spiritual and psychological rehabilitation for youth and veterans, and several maintenance records from the early 1970s. But the intake log was missing pages. Specifically, pages 5, 6, and 7 had been torn out, not removed with staples or tabs, but violently ripped paper from that whose unfamiliar fate and unyielding. A small white sticker had been affixed to the last full page with a single typed word. Camille asked the assistant librarian, a quiet Sumerian named Brent, if the file had been altered recently. He frowned. "We've had no reason to touch that file in years. It's not even supposed to be circulated. Who told you about it?" Camille didn't answer. Instead, she photocopied what she could and left quickly, heart pounding. That night, while her children slept, she examined the materials again under better light. The dates didn't line up. The building permit for the chapel on the St. Alora property was approved in 1958, but the charter listed 1963 as the founding year. More curious was a footnote in the margin of one document, C-209A, bell mechanism testimony. That phrase gnawed at her. The bell. Again, the bell. The same bell that Ethel had claimed rang when it shouldn't. the same bell that Father Thomas wrote about. Camille tried to call Tilda again the next morning, but the number rang endlessly, then went dead. She considered bringing the files to the sheriff, but something in her bones said not to. Instead, she drove back to the church and sat in the back pew after hours, laying the photo flat against her knees. She stared at Father Michael's face, then at the children. She counted 13. That number felt wrong. She remembered a sermon Father Calhoun once gave just before he vanished about the 13 echoes of sacrifice. She thought it was metaphor. Now she wasn't sure. Father David Linwood arrived at St. Isidore's Parish almost exactly 1 year after Father Michael had first vanished, and for a time the community dared to hope he would last. A tall, soft-spoken man in his 40s, Father David came with a calming presence, the kind of voice that lingered in memory long after the final hymn. He rarely spoke of his predecessors, but when pressed, he acknowledged them in his homilies only as those who walked before us, who bore burdens we still do not fully understand. Unlike the previous priests, he kept a journal, an old Hashan habit he claimed helped him keep his mind steady. It was leather-bound, always resting near the edge of his desk, and he was never seen without a pen tucked behind his ear. Parishioners noticed he often stayed late in the chapel after evening mass, sometimes well past midnight. When asked, he would only say, "There are prayers that prefer the dark." What no one knew was that the date he arrived, October 3rd, was also the anniversary of Father Michael's disappearances. That coincidence began to trouble him over time, especially as he grew aware of the undercurrents humming through the parish walls. The way the bell tower still emitted strange rhythmic echoes no one could trace, or the lingering scent of incense that appeared some mornings even when no service had been held. In the weeks leading up to the next October 3rd, Father David had grown visibly restless. He shortened his sermons. He requested fewer altar boys. He no longer entered the sacristy alone. That night, the anniversary night, the skies above Pinecrest were clear, no rain, no thunder, no distractions. But by sunrise, Father David was gone. The church was locked from the inside. His bed remained made, breakfast dishes untouched. But on the altar, there was his journal, open to a single page and centered between 2 extinguished candles. Written in bold strokes, different from his usual careful hand, were the words, "They do not die, they are used." The phrase sent a ripple through the diocese once it leaked, but as with the others, the official response was muted, coldly procedural. No investigation, no explanation, no explanation. It was around this time that Isaac Dunley returned to town. At 22, he had just left seminary training, citing health concerns and a crisis of clarity. Before that, he had served as an altar boy at St. Isidore's from age 12 until 17, witnessing the tenures of Father Michael and, briefly, Father Thomas. He hadn't spoken publicly about what he'd seen until Father David's vanishing. That afternoon, he walked into Sheriff Harlan's office and asked to give a statement, not as a witness to a crime, but as someone carrying the burden of memory. "It was a Sunday evening," Isaac began. "I was supposed to help close the chapel. This was before Father Michael disappeared. Maybe a few months before." He said he had finished extinguishing the candles and was headed toward the rear corridor when he heard voices, low, rhythmic, almost chanting. Curious, and not entirely unafraid, he tiptoed back and peeked through the door leading to the old meeting room that hadn't been used in years. "There were 4 of them," he said, 4 priests, but only 3 I recognized, Father Michael, Father Thomas, and someone from the seminary. The 4th I couldn't name. He wore bishop's robes, but no cross, no ring. His face was pale like wax. I swear he didn't blink." Isaac paused, visibly trembling, an abysmal failing, speaking in Latin, but it wasn't any prayer I'd ever learned. It sounded like invocation. The others repeated parts of it, heads bowed. Sheriff Harlan had listened in silence, then asked why he hadn't told anyone sooner. Isaac's eyes were hollow when he replied, "I thought I dreamed it," until they started disappearing one by one. His statement was filed but quietly buried. No charges, no media coverage. The diocese offered no comment, but word spread, as it always does in towns like Pinecrest. Camille heard about it from Tilda's niece. Ethel Caraway, now housebound, requested the transcript read to her twice. then murmured the four corners, the four voices, and drifted into sleep. That Sunday, the church was half empty. Those who did come left quickly after Mass, refusing eye contact with the new seminarian sent to replace Father David. The quiet unraveling of Pinecrest's confidence in the church reached a slow crescendo in the weeks following Isaac's statement. Whispers grew sharper, questions louder, but the answers never came. Instead, what emerged were fragments, not from the mouth of priests or bishops, but from those whose lives had only briefly brushed against the vanished men. The first crack came in the form of a phone call to Camille. The voice on the other end was old, gravelly, measured. "This is Meredith Kearney," the woman said. "I believe you knew my son, Father Thomas." Camille confirmed gently, noting the grief still laced in every word. Meredith wasn't calling for condolences, she had a question. "Was there ever mention," she asked slowly, "of something called the Vigil of Renewal?" Camille paused. The phrase meant nothing to her. "He mentioned it to me once," Meredith continued. 6 days before he disappeared. Said he'd been chosen to attend it. Something confidential. He said it wasn't in the liturgical calendar, but that it came with instruction from the Archbishop's office directly. Her voice trembled. "I thought it was some kind of retreat, but when I called the Chancery, after he vanished, they said no such thing existed." Meredith explained that her son had been nervous in the days leading up to the event. He kept rereading scripture late at night and had locked away his crucifix in the drawer. Said he didn't want it to be a distraction, she recalled. That same week, Camille decided to revisit St. Isidore's with Isaac, who had become, reluctantly, something of a local guide to the mystery. They asked to review security footage from the church's entryway cameras, archived videos stored on the parish system and accessible only by the parish administrator. With some persuasion, the new assistant, young, unaware of most history, granted them limited access. The system was clunky, a lever to furb a budget up chapter 2009, but functional. Isaac guided the fast-forward, his hand steady until the cursor hovered over the night of Father David's disappearance. Camille leaned in. The footage from October 3rd began clearly, David entering the chapel at 11:13 p.m., a candle in one hand, journal in the other. He paused at the altar, genuflected, then turned toward the sacristy door. The frame skipped. 1 second, he was mid-stepped. The next, he was gone. The timecode blinked ahead, 11:14 to 11:37, 23 minutes erased. Camille frowned. Try Father Thomas. Isaac located the files from April 11th, 8 months earlier, the same story, clear visuals up until 10:41 p.m., then abrupt jump to 11:02 when the camera showed an empty sanctuary. They ran the same test on the night of Calhoun, and finally on the night of Father Michael. All 4 instances shared the same signature, an unaccounted 20 to 30-minute gap during which the last known footage of each priest was captured. "These aren't camera malfunctions," Isaac whispered. "Someone deleted them. Cleanly." When asked, the parish tech claimed ignorance to a powerful access deletion protocols, he said, bewildered. "The backups are all locked, password protected with bishop-level clearance." Camille left the room with Isaac trailing behind, her mind spinning. The Vigil of Renewal, deleted footage, a bishop's level of access. She called Meredith back. "Do you remember who invited him?" she asked. Meredith hesitated. "He only said it came from a man with the ring, but no robes. Said he wasn't dressed like clergy, but carried the authority of one." Camille then contacted Tilda's niece, who worked clerical support at the Archdiocese's archives. Using an old login, she checked for mentions of the Vigil of Renewal in regional records. Nothing turned up until she searched Restricted Memo Chain. There, buried in a 2002 memo chain, flagged Internal Only, was a redacted calendar entry with a Latin heading. Time, variable. Participants, individually summoned. Authorization, see Cardinal Level Directive. Below that, a final line, to be conducted through silence. Cam sat there to the meeting. She sat alone in her living room, the envelope with the photocopies still on the table, the journal photocopies fanned out like tarot cards before her. Somewhere, buried behind the sanitized face of church bureaucracy, lay a ritual no one dared acknowledge, involving men who no longer existed in any official capacity. She now believed that whatever had been done to Father Michael had not been an accident, nor a lone tragedy. It was part of something sanctioned, something orchestrated. Camille never intended to become an investigator. She had children, a job, a church to sing in every Sunday. But something about those video skips, about Meredith Kearney's quiet desperation and Isaac's tremors, had shifted her from observer to participant. In the days after discovering the redacted, Vigil and Freemay screechinating photos for details she might have missed. One morning after driving her youngest to school, she detoured past the rectory and noticed the church van still parked in the side lot. That struck her as odd. Father David's van hadn't been moved since his disappearances. She called Sheriff Harlan to inquire about it, but the department claimed jurisdiction had been surrendered to the diocese. "It's not our property," he said flatly. Camille didn't believe him. That evening, under the excuse of helping clean out the food pantry storage, she entered the rectory with a borrowed set of keys from the assistant pastor. She made her way to Father David's study. The room was exactly as he'd left it. A coffee mug, now dried and cracked, sat beside a stack of envelopes. But what caught her attention was the GPS unit still suctioned to the inside of the study window, facing outward. It was a commercial-grade GPS, one with a memory chip. She carefully removed it and slipped it into her purse. Back home, with Isaac seated beside her, she booted up her laptop and loaded the GPS's stored logs. What they found froze them both. The last recorded trip before Father David's disappearance wasn't to the hospital or the diocesan office or even another church. It was to a coordinate deep in the wooded outskirts west of town, a place labeled on the map simply as Mountain Breathe Hollow. Isaac recognized the name faintly. There was an old monastery there, he said. St. Alora's Retreat, not the children's haven. This one was strictly for clergy. Shut down in the 70s after funding collapsed, Camille zoomed in. The marker lay near an overgrown road that no longer appeared on most modern maps. Without hesitation, they agreed to go. 2 days later, they drove out at dawn in Camille's pickup, bouncing over uneven terrain until asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt. The road narrowed into a path, and soon they had to continue on foot. The forest was thick, but not wild, something about the way the trees grew too broad, arranged as though trimmed by unseen hands. After an hour's hike, they found it. The structure emerged like a memory, vines crawling over stone walls, its peaked roof still intact despite the years. The cross atop its bell tower had broken, leaving only a twisted metal base. No power lines, Heathcote said, no generator sounds, and yet Camille stepped forward, noticing faint footprints in the muddy soil, too recent to be decades old. Inside the air was still. Dust coated every surface, but the floors had been swept. A single wooden pew faced a small altar. Upon it sat a burned-down candle, fresh wax clinging to the holder. In one corner, near what had once been a vestry, was a cot with a woolen blanket folded at the end. Beneath it, a basin of clean water. Isaac checked the drawers. He found a cracked Bible, pages dog-eared, but none struck through, and beside it, a hand-carved rosary. But there were no signs of food, no personal belongings beyond those, no electric lights, no plumbing, yet someone had clearly been there. Camille climbed the stairs to the bell tower. From there she saw the pattern, a clearing in the shape of a cross behind the structure, surrounded by arranged stones. In its center, a circle of scorched earth. "A fire pit?" she asked. Isaac joined her, then shook his head. Too symmetrical, too intentional. That night, back in town, Camille compared the GPS timestamp with the disappearance timeline. Father David had visited the monastery twice, once a week before he vanished, and again the night he did. The second time, he never returned. Camille returned to the abandoned monastery the following week, this time alone. Isaac had grown distant after the last visit, his hands increasingly unsteady, his voice fading to whispers as though whatever they'd stirred up in those woods had followed him back. She didn't blame him. There was something different about that place, something beyond cold stone and forgotten relics. It gnawed at her, even in dreams. She packed carefully, flashlight, gloves, a small notebook, and 2 extra batteries. This time, she came prepared to search deeper. The sun was high when she reached the threshold again, but inside the monastery, shadows hung heavy. She retraced their previous steps, past the main chapel, into the side hallways, lined with crumbling arches, toward a rusted iron gate they hadn't forced open before. This time, she pushed it with her shoulder until it groaned and gave way, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The air grew colder with each step, damp and stale as though untouched for decades. At the bottom, she found a small antechamber with 3 doors. One led to what seemed to be storage, broken crates, dusty books. The second was a crypt, rows of empty niches carved into the stone. But it was the third that drew her in. It opened into a study, or what was left of one. A wooden desk sagged in the middle, weighed down by damp scrolls and broken ink bottles. The far wall bore faded tapestries, their gold thread dulled to bronze, and on the desk, beneath a cracked pane of glass, lay a parchment unlike the others, sealed with wax, marked by an unfamiliar crest, a diagonal cross inside a circle, its points flared like flame. She pried it open carefully. The document was in Latin, handwritten in a formal ecclesiastical script. Though her Latin was limited, she could make out most of the message. It was a decree, unsigned, undated, but clearly old. The most chilling line read, Corporeus se tradunt, ut veritatem abscondent quae, ecclesia nunquam confiteri potest. She translated slowly. They surrender their bodies to hide the truth the Church can never confess. Beneath that, a list. Name. 4 were smudged and unreadable. One was not. Mem R. Callahan. Father Michael's full name. Camille stumbled backward, the paper trembling in her hands. These weren't deaths. They were offerings. Voluntary or not, these men had been taken for a purpose beyond silence. She turned to leave and noticed a passage behind the tapestry, a narrow gap in the stone leading into what seemed like a storage vault. But as she stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Her flashlight flickered, then steadied, casting light over the chamber. What she saw stole her breath. At the center of the room, on a raised platform near what once might have been a subsidiary altar, lay a figure. Not decomposed, not skeletal, creverse. Waxen skin stretched smooth over sunken cheeks, but the features were unmistakable. It was Father Thomas. She had seen him once at a funeral, the shape of his jaw, the small scar under his brow. It was him, but he wasn't buried. He was displayed like a statue, reverently placed in a position of honor. Around him, candles had burned down to stubs. Above the altar, a Latin inscription, Silence is obedience. In obedience, redemption. Camille turned slowly, bile rising in her throat. This was not a tomb, it was a shrine. Someone had kept him like this for years, preserved through means she didn't want to understand. She snapped one photo, then fled the vault, stumbling back into the staircase light. Camille hadn't told anyone about the embalmed body yet. Not Isaac, not even the sheriff. Something about it didn't feel safe, not just because of what she had found, but because of what it implied. There had been no death certificate, no announcement, no funeral. Father Thomas had simply vanished, and the diocese had allowed it to remain unexplained. Now she knew why. He hadn't been buried, he had been offered. Days after her discovery, headlines broke across local Catholic circles. Bishop Calderon, who had overseen Pinecrest and neighboring counties for more than 15 years, was being reassigned to a diplomatic post in Buenos Aires. The announcement was terse, no cause given, no mention of illness, scandal, or even retirement, just effective immediately. The diocesan website removed his photo within hours. The local parish bulletin replaced his name with interim leadership pending. Camilla didn't believe in coincidences anymore. She printed the photograph of Father Thomas's body and sealed it in a manila envelope, mailing it anonymously to 3 different Catholic media watchdogs. Then she called Tilda's niece again. "I need Vatican correspondence," she said, "specifically anything mentioning purification rituals or doctrinal bans." The niece, who now worked under limited access at the Archdiocese archives, hesitated but agreed. 3 days later, Camille received an encrypted email with 2 scanned pages, internal letters written in 1954 Bonetti, addressed to regional bishops across North America. The subject, Ritual of Soul Purification at Ame. The Ritual of Soul Purification. It was a ritual once practiced quietly in the 19th century, intended to symbolically cleanse spiritual leaders of doubt, despair, or guilt, by physical submission to the altar, through fasting, confinement, and in some documented cases, simulated death. The second letter confirmed what Camille feared. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith hereby declares the ritual heretical and discontinued indefinitely due to abuse, misuse of liturgical symbolism, and psychological harm inflicted on clergy participants. The practice was banned, sealed, and, according to the footnote, any future iteration to be reported and dissolved immediately. But someone in Pinecrest had revived it? Camille leaned back in her chair, pulse in her ears. The words used in Father David's journal, the Latin phrasing carved above the altar in the monastery, the bishop's sudden removal, it was all connected. She began cross-referencing dates of each priest's disappearance with regional clergy schedules. Each had reportedly taken part in a private retreat signed off by the bishop. None of those retreats had public records. She remembered Meredith Kearney's words. He said it wasn't in the liturgical calendar. Camille's next move was riskier. She reached out to a contact she hadn't spoken to in years, Sister Elise, once a theological ethics professor at a Catholic college before leaving her order without public explanation. Camille sent the document excerpts and waited. Elise responded with a single-voice message. I was shown the ritual once, in Rome. It was never meant for use. It was a cautionary archive, a warning, not a guideline. If they brought it back, they broke something sacred, and the Church won't protect them. It'll erase them. That phrase stuck with Camille. Erase them. Not correct, not reprimand, erase. As if these men, Michael, Thomas, Calhoun, David, hadn't just been misled or victimized, but deliberately removed to protect something larger. Camille now understood the extent of the complicity. The silence wasn't accidental. The bishop had authorized the ritual, revived what had been buried, used it to transform these men into vessels of concealment. And when it became too loud, too risky, they moved him, disappeared him upward into diplomacy. That same night, another envelope arrived at Camille's door, no return address, postmarked from within the Diocese. Inside was a single page, typed on a mechanical typewriter. It read, "He allowed it because they asked for it. They feared what they might become. We gave them purpose instead." The paper smelled faintly of incense and dust. Camille burned it. It was almost midnight when the phone rang in the rectory annex, where the parish council occasionally held after-hours meetings. Howard Callan, a retired teacher and one of the longest-serving members of St. Isidore's lay council, picked it up instinctively. Static buzzed at first, followed by a raspy breath, then a voice, fragile, hollow, yet unmistakably human. "Howard, it's Michael." Howard froze. "Michael who?" The voice trembled. "Don't look anymore. Please, don't look. You'll find more than you're ready to carry." The line went dead. No caller ID, no trace. Howard collapsed into a chair, pale and shaking. He knew that voice. He had prayed with that voice. The man he once served beside had been gone for nearly 5 years. He told no one for 3 days. When he finally confided in Camille, she didn't react with surprise, only a strange, quiet sorrow. "He's still alive," she said, "or something close to it." She knew then that there was only one place left where the answers might be. One final descent. She waited for a stormy morning to return to the monastery, figuring bad weather would keep others away. This time she brought rope, her phone with the GPS tracker live, and a printed copy of the Vatican ban letter sealed in plastic. She walked through mud and thorn until the stones appeared again, that familiar silence rising like a pressure in the lungs. She didn't pause. She headed straight for the rear stairwell, the one behind the torn tapestry, and stepped down into the vaults. Her flashlight beam swept along damp stone, past the alcove where Father Thomas had been displayed, to a rusted gate she hadn't noticed before, partially obscured by debris. The gate was chained but old, cold radiated up. She had descended 3 steps when the voices came. Not echoes, real voices. Firm, commanding. "Step back. You're in a restricted area." Camille turned to see 2 men in dark tactical uniforms, not police, but not military either. No insignia, no badges. Behind them, a third man stood at the edge of the vault's doorway, holding what looked like a satellite radio. "This location is now secured under federal directive," one of them said. "We're asking you to leave immediately." Camille's heart pounded. "Federal? Why?" "This is church land." The man didn't flinch. "It's a matter of national security." She held her ground. "What's down there?" The second man stepped forward. "That's classified." She pulled the printed Vatican letter from her bag and held it up. "This ritual was condemned 70 years ago. What you're guarding isn't just illegal, it's her heresy." The man didn't look at the paper. "That's not our concern. You need to leave, Ms. Renshaw." "What about Father Michael?" she asked. "He called someone. He's alive. Or, we said enough." His tone dropped. "Walk away. No one will ask you again." The cold around them deepened. It wasn't just physical anymore. It felt aware. Camille looked past the agents, down into the stairwell that twisted out of sight. She felt it, the weight of all she'd learned, all she'd lost. She could descend, force it, but she might not come back, and she knew now why the others had never returned. They hadn't been silenced. They had submitted, willingly or not, to something older than power, older than doctrine. She stepped back, her voice cracked. "If I leave now, you'll bury it again." The man's silence was confirmation enough. They escorted her out, not with hostility, but with an eerie efficiency. No threats, no arrests, just disappearance, clean and complete. That evening, the monastery was officially declared condemned due to structural collapse risk. The entrance was welded shut. The local paper ran a notice 3 days later. No mention of clergy, no names. Camille returned to her home and didn't sleep for 3 nights, but on the 4th she lit a single candle, placed it by her window, and whispered a prayer. Not for answers, but for mercy, for those who gave their bodies to a truth too heavy to speak. If this story gripped you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real feeling mysteries based on chilling disappearances and long-buried truth. Which moment in this story stayed with you the most? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're reading everyone.